This episode of Art Block is brought to you by the supporters of my Patreon. If you would like to support the show, the link to my Patreon is in the description below. Hello, and welcome to Art Block, the show where we talk about art and how it's made. I'm with Aramau, and today we'll be covering the history and evolution of animation, more specifically animated cartoons.
And I'm here because I was the cheapest guest star and I like watching cartoons. Let us begin! Since animation, in the form we are most familiar with, began when film became more common, we will not be going over earlier, more rudimentary forms of animation, such as shadow puppets, shadow boxes, and flipbooks. Instead, we will focus on what I, a lowly plebeian, can recognize as animation. Rubber hoses! Wait, what?
Yes, rubber hose animation, the early man, so to speak, of what would eventually become our modern-day animation. Starting off in the early 20th century, what we call rubber hose animation is referring to a specific style prevalent in early animation. Classics such as Disney's Steamboat Willie and Oswald the Rabbit come to mind. This style of art was often known for being very cartoony and generally having a very exaggerated and rubbery motion to the limbs.
Thus, hoses. Not a very sophisticated name for what probably took an insane amount of time and effort to do, but there you go. Also key to any early animator's toolbox were celluloid sheets, or cells. In order to make the characters move, first the characters were drawn with ink and paper and then transferred over to the transparent cells. These cells were captured by the film frame by frame to simulate movement against a painted stationary background.
Though many assume rubber hose animation to simply be limited to black and white, the style still prevails in other colored cartoons released by Disney and other animation studios at the time. Silly symphonies such as the Cookie Carnival and Ferdinand carried traits that were commonly seen in rubber hose animation, primarily the noodly and unrealistic nature of the movement. Given that animation was still in its early stages, the techniques to make it appear more realistic hadn't really been developed, such as easing or time coding. As such, everything is drawn on once, making animation smooth but not particularly lifelike in comparison to films developed later in the century. Now, given this was all done without computers, some might wonder how one would make these drawings appear to have depth and go in and out of the background. This comes with the invention of the multi-plane camera, a large device where animation cells were placed on platforms along with the painted backgrounds at different distances from the camera. Then the picture is taken. This method of capture would continue to be used all the way until the late 20th century. However, one of its most major uses was in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Dwarves? Dwarfs? Dwarfi? Not sure. Either way, this technique was the reason it took early Walt Disney Studios so long to put out feature-length films, especially ones as detailed and complex as Fantasia and Snow White. There was a 3-year gap between Snow White and the next 2 movies that came out. They were still trying to get it down. The movies were shorter than we are used to now, and most were just cobbled together skits put to music like Saludos Amigos, Make Mine Music, and Fun and Fancy Free. But they kept at it, and by the time the golden age of animation came along in the 1960s, Disney was way ahead with 19 movies under their belts. And we haven't even talked about Disney's biggest competitors, Warner Brothers with Bugs Bunny, and Hanna-Barbera with Tom and Jerry, both coming out in 1940. Obviously, those studios produced lovable characters with similar longevity as Disney, but neither of them did it in feature film form.
As we enter the 1960s, we see a few notable changes come along with the animation industry, both in film and television. For one, Disney had begun to take somewhat of a dive with their animation division due to budgeting issues, problems that would be exacerbated later with flops such as The Black Cauldron. In this golden era of animation, television in particular would start to take a more romantic and realistic approach, reducing the amount of motion in exchange for more detailed character models. Examples such as the early Batman cartoons being one of the few to come to mind. This era in particular is also when animation and television became far more prominent due to techniques that made animation cost much less than it did before.
One major component to making animation cheaper was the introduction of the Xerox method. No, not photocopying your butt and putting it in the movie, get out of here. Most people have probably heard of Xeroxing before, and in animation what would happen is that instead of hand painting the lines on each individual cell, animation companies would have their artists sketch bold lines on paper and then have the machine copy the lines right onto the cell. Of course, they still had to hand paint the colors onto the back, but given how time-consuming inking and painting were at the time, this process majorly reduced the amount of time it took to create an animation frame by freaking frame.
The most prevalent example of this technique can be seen in the film 101 Dalmatians, where all of the characters were Xeroxed directly onto the cells, some even being copied and pasted in order to accommodate for the larger amount of characters. To be frank, I don't think that film would have even been possible had it not been for the introduction of Xeroxing, as it would have been far too expensive to hand ink and paint all those puppies.
I would have cut off my hands rather than have done it. Expensive wouldn't be the issue, dear. Plus, I feel like anyone they assigned to do that would have literally turned into the Glenn Close version of Cruella.
Starting around the 1980s, we also observed the popularization of adult-oriented animation, shows such as The Simpsons and later Futurama being prevalent examples. What?
Oh, nothing. I just have absolutely no interest in most of these shows. One can only take so much stupid at one time.
Suit yourself, more screen time for me. Though adult-oriented animation was certainly nothing new, The Simpsons in particular skyrocketed the genre into whole new heights, later bringing similar shows such as Family Guy, King of the Hill, South Park, and the more recent example of Bob's Burgers. Though most shows use the same animation techniques as family-friendly shows, the higher age rating opened up the doors for more vulgar humor, bloodier, and more visceral jokes, well, and political commentary.
Oh goody, more politics. Can't we keep politics out of my fun, please?
Nope. Even cartoons are littered by the trash that is politics.
Fine. With the evolution of technology came the evolution of techniques. And soon the caps came into play. This was a smoother style of animation that integrated 3D animated backgrounds and certain items with the 2D animated foreground work. Take the flying scene from Rescuers Down Under, for example. The fluid movement of the scenery is 3D, and I believe so is the eagle, but the boy in his flappy shirt is done in 2D. I do not envy that particular shirt artist. May their metacarpals rest in peace.
One of the biggest advantages with the cap system being incorporated is that animators no longer had to worry about running out of ink or having to hand paint individual cells. As almost everything was digital, palettes could remain consistent, and no longer would frames have to be manually scanned with a multiplane camera. Though it would be a while for this technology to appear on the television market, the use of digital cells and backgrounds ended up making animation far more cost-efficient, and thus allowed for animation companies to get more in for their budget. One of the more prevalent examples of using the system was in the aforementioned Futurama, a show that featured both three-dimensional backgrounds and two-dimensional characters. This allowed for more dynamic and complex camera angles. For example, most of the shots of the ships and the buildings outside were often 3D rendered objects instead of 2D drawings.
And of course, the natural graduation from a mix of 2D and 3D animation is just straight up 3D animation. Now, Toy Story was the first fully 3D CGI movie, and obviously it did well, but it took a little show called Reboot to do it first on TV. Yes, Reboot came out in 1994, 1 year before Toy Story, and doing a fully 3D animated show was ambitious to say the least. You can kind of see that the animators were a little out of their depth with quality, but for the time, and being that it was the first of its kind, it's incredible what those Canucks were able to actually pull off. Oh, and don't forget VeggieTales, premiering its first video in 1993. Yeah, the Christian salad bar beat Pixar. Eat it.
I think most of them were actually fruit.
Botany is weird. Also, shout out to clay model animation pioneer Nick Park of Aardman Animations for popularizing the distinctly unique and intricate practice. The famous claymation duo of Wallace and Gromit first premiered in A Grand Day Out in 1989, the same year as his Academy Award-winning short Creature Comforts. Claymation had appeared before in other series, see Pee-wee's Playhouse, but this was one of the first instances of such well-made and animated characters being the focus of a short or feature film. I'd give you snaps, but I no longer have thumbs. Who'd have thought I'd miss those things?
Anywho, back to drawing things. With a good portion of animation moving to the digital medium, we move into the modern era of cartoons. Starting around the year 2000, animation started to take a different approach given the new technology. 2D animated films were some of the biggest in scale, such as Atlantis the Lost Empire and Treasure Planet, both thanks to the CAP system and the incorporation of a 3D system called Deep Canvas. At this point in history, 2D animation also started taking a bit of a backseat to 3D, with films such as Shrek shaking up the market and lovely 2D films like The Princess and the Frog getting pushed aside. I'm looking at you, Mandy Moore.
CGI not only began to take over animated films, it started to invade and infect live-action films as well. Like, sure, I completely understand car explosions being animated. Saves money and possibly fewer stuntmen endangered by doing that. But certain aspects that should be kept as practical effects Jurassic Park started to slowly fade away to make room for new, shiny, and obviously very fake CG facsimiles. This is not a rant, this is an educational thing, I think. CG animation is incredibly complex to get right, and I highly respect the artists who do it well. Not only do you have to plan every movement the base puppet makes, You have to plan every movement their hair, clothes, scales, claws, everything makes. We think of nodding as just bobbing our heads up and down, but an animator has to consider where the hair goes, will it spill over the shoulder, what happens to the neck fat and eye movement, etc., etc. And programming all of these variables takes time, blood, sweat, and tears. Probably sacrificing a virgin to some benevolent god in there too in order to make a deadline.
Though CGI did come with a fairly rough start, it is undeniable how it has revolutionized the animation industry so far. Due to the advantages of the medium, films could appear more realistic and textured, more detail could be added, and once most of the bugs were worked out, 3D animation eventually became less expensive and time-consuming compared to the 2D animations of the day. Though 3D was evolving quickly, 2D certainly did not disappear entirely. As time went on, the development of puppet-based animation, i.e. flash animation, came into sight. While 3D had begun to rule the film market, animated cartoons had begun to take on a new coat of paint with the introduction of flash animation. Given the fact that flash animation was far less time-consuming, 2D animated shows began to move over to this technique. An early player in this game was a Canadian animated program called Total Drama Island, which quickly grew to popularity on the Cartoon Network. Soon, other shows from all genres would start to use this technique, from 2009's Archer to 2011's The Amazing World of Gumball, and so on.
Should we get into the controversially similar art styles of modern cartoons, or should we just skip to the darkening of modern children's shows to the point where they treat the audience more intelligently than some adult shows do?
The second one.
Right! Starting around the mid to late 2000s, kids' shows began treating their audiences more maturely. The lesson wasn't painted black and white, the main characters made either more human mistakes or huge ones that would span multiple episodes and change their characters. See freaking seasons 2 and 4 of Teen Titans with the Terra arc and Trigon arc. I would argue this trend truly started in 1994 with the advent of the criminally short-lived and "Where is my DVD box set, Disney?" series, Gargoyles. But that is neither here nor there. Shows like Phineas and Ferb, Gravity Falls, My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, Steven Universe, Young Justice, Tell Me When to Stop.
You can move on.
Shows like these treated the target age group like they were a little older and more mature, and tackled subjects more blatantly than their predecessors. See the racism episode for Teen Titans, the gender issues in Steven Universe, and the dilemma of ethics, mysticism, and belief in Gravity Falls. Meanwhile, 80s kids got shows that shilled toys and had bears that shot tummy lasers. We win.
This also brings us into the era of acquiring animated shows. Though it seems almost gone nowadays, back in the earlier days, most shows were only aired on cable television, soon moving over to more universal methods such as DirecTV and Comcast providing a more modernized version of the VCR. Starting in the late 2000s, we also had the introduction of streaming services such as Netflix and Hulu. These services allowed one to watch cartoons at any time they please, and instead of having to wait for the new air times, they could simply watch episode after episode without having to take a break, leading to where we are today. With the introduction of Netflix originals and licensed properties, streaming services have brought one final change to the animation industry as of late. More concepts can be explored, ratings can be surpassed, and different storytelling methods can be used due to the more accessible methods of the service. Though there are countless styles and techniques of animation that can be explored with this new means of watching television. From here on out, we only have to see what animation has to bring us.
I have discovered something about myself while thinking about this. I prefer animation to live action. With live action, there's only so much you can do. And I swear everything except rom-coms have CGI in them somehow anyways. But with animation, you're only limited by your imagination, which is barely even a limit. The Nightmare Before Christmas, Kiki's Delivery Service, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. These movies would be nowhere near as magical live action.
Are they making a live action Hunchback?
I will cut you with a spoon. And shows like Codename Kids Next Door, Tom and Jerry, and MMLP would only work in animated form because the humor and aesthetics would be completely lost. Plus, training horses to talk would take forever. Animation is just magic from the artist's fingers to the screen, and personally, it makes me happiest.
So, what's your favorite kind of animation? Are you a classic 2D fan, or do you prefer the modern aesthetic of 3D? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And that's about it for today's episode. If you liked what you saw and you want to see more, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. It supports me and is practically free. Also be sure to subscribe to Ari, who is kind enough to come onto the show with me today. If you guys want to keep up with the show, be sure to follow me on Twitter and DeviantArt where I post artwork and updates. I also have a Discord server where gold rank patrons and up get their access to their own special rank. There you can talk to me one-on-one in both a private text and voice channel. Thank you all so much for watching, I'm Spirit, and I'll see you next time.